Can you take us through the process of narrative film versus documentary? What are the differences in shooting feature films of either of those two?
Well, the differences between doing a documentary or narrative in the sense that you have to tell a story isn't any different, right? The difference is that in a documentary you have a concept, right? It's like, here's a one-sentence logline about the film that I think I'm going to make. Usually, by the end of that filming period, the film you thought you were making is usually much different than the film you made. I also find that can sometimes be the same in narrative films because you go in with one idea about here's what's on the page, but when you bring in performers who have their own ideas and thoughts, I believe, again, philosophically as a director, if you're going to engage actors or a DP or anyone, you really should permit them to use the skills that they're trained in. And so they're going to have ideas and thoughts that will change the general idea and trajectory of the film. But those are similarities. The difference is, in a documentary, is that you've got to assemble the story as you're going. And so it's not that I'm working from a script and saying, oh, what do I need to cut out? Or we're running out of time, or do we need to rework this? Maybe the dialogue isn't working. In a documentary, it's being cognizant of tracking your story as you're shooting it to say, this is the log line I started with, and now it's tracking towards something different. If that difference is a better film, how do I get from here to here? Because you're doing it in real time. And so if you're successful and you come out on the other end with a good film because you've tracked it and you've figured it out, I think it makes your narrative storytelling much better because A, you have a better idea of human behavior and how people do things, how things are constructed, but B, you go through this deconstruction of story in real time that you don't have to go through when you're shooting a narrative film. That's something that you would typically do in script development, right? But it enables you to do that development much better because then you can poke holes in the structure of story that I think that might be a little harder if you didn't have documentary experience.
Yeah, having spoken with a few documentary filmmakers on how they go in to shoot one story and then
it's different.
Drastically some major things happen, and then they're like, okay, do we make the same film?
Right.
Do we stop? And having
and
to...
I think it's wiser to follow the story where it goes. Sometimes, it goes in unexpected directions. Even the film I just directed about Lucia Lucas, the opera singer in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the Tulsa Opera, I walked in with one log line that she's the first transgender opera singer in American history to have a leading role. But as I'm shooting, it was very apparent to me, even walking into it, that you can't make that be your film. That's the reason you're there, but that's not necessarily the film. Those are two very different things. And so as I'm shooting, I had to follow the story and open up to other characters and figure out how they all interact together, what pieces of a puzzle you need to kind of create a total picture of how an opera is put together, how it's performed and delivered on the backdrop of an international news story that's also in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a very unlikely place. So you're triangulating, in that sense, all of these different elements to create the narrative. And so if you do your job right, I think as a documentarian, your job is to apply those narrative film skills to your documentary. But as a documentary filmmaker, you're nimble enough to follow that story wherever it goes.
Were you thinking of how to approach it during the flight to Tulsa, or once you got there and entered the world?
Oh, no. Well, I had lots of conversations before I got there. That film came together very quickly. The producers emailed me about a month before it was supposed to be filmed, and they said, here's the log line, are you interested? And I was fascinated immediately, and I called them and I said, I know nothing about opera. I've never been to an opera in my life, so I love this story. I think it's could be interesting, but I don't know if I should do this. And they said, we actually think because you've never been to an opera and because you know nothing about opera, that you actually might be the perfect person because you'd look at it in a different way. And so once they gave me permission to be okay with that, I started thinking more about what I thought the story should be. And, you know, I had Skype calls with Lucia, who lives in Germany, and then, you know, a couple of those in advance to try to get a better sense of who she was, what makes her tick, things like that. And then as I'm getting to Tulsa and as I have this kind of base of knowledge, that was structured in a way where they're, you know, doing an opera in 30 days, right? So it's a very, you know, straightforward structure. It's going from point A to point B, so I'm not having to invent that, right? It's a kind of behind the scenes film in that sense. But as you're filming, you realize that there are elements that you need to include that you wouldn't have necessarily picked up just from Lucia or just from the opera itself. Things about the town, things about the opera company, things about the nature of being a performer. These are all things that you kind of have to follow as you're filming to be cognizant of, to be aware of, so you know what the best version of the film is that you're capable of making.
And there are opera groupies.
Yeah.
And they run the gamut of ages.
Great.
It's really
fascinating.
interesting.
I mean, learning about opera, I mean, I'll go to the opera now. It was really a fascinating experience. And I still don't fully I understand mechanically what it means to project and sing. I don't know how they do it. I mean, watching them, if you ever get the opportunity to make a film with professional musicians from all over the world, do that film. It's a great experience. The director of the show is from the Royal Opera in London. The artistic director is Tobias Picker, one of the most prolific living opera composers today. He did an adaptation of Roald Dahl's Fantastic Mr. Fox. He's doing an adaptation of The Danish Girl. The conductor's from Uruguay. Lucia's from Germany. I mean, it was a cast of people from all over the world with different sensibilities, but all of them with world-class, literally, talent. They're some of the top people in that profession, and it was really cool. It's really, really cool.